I lived in Louisville, Kentucky. This is before doctoral work and joining the faculty of Columbia Seminary, et cetera. And when I was there, I worshiped at the Crescent Hill Presbyterian Church in Louisville, which is in the Crescent Hill neighborhood. This is a congregation of about 125, 130 members. We couldn't afford a youth worker full-time. We were all volunteers. I was one of the volunteers, even as a denominational staff person. And so we had a great time, a bunch of us volunteers working with one of our pastors. We had two co-pastors who each shared a time and a quarter position, a married couple, and were fantastic. We gathered to our number one fall, a couple, Ann and Scott. Ann's the mom, Scott's the son. I tell this story wherever I go because it tells me about hope. Scott, 17 years old, rising junior in high school, came to us from Grosse Pointe, Michigan. Ann, Scott. They'd been through a divorce that summer, very sudden. Issues of betrayal. Husband, dad had an affair, and it was found out, and it was a mess, and so Scott moves down to Louisville. His mom gets a job, and she moves down, and Scott comes with her. Rising junior, probably the only time worse to move is if you're a rising senior in high school. He left behind in Detroit area, Grosse Pointe, Michigan, a girlfriend whom he loved very much. Well, he was supposed to start that winter on his high school basketball team after working his way up to junior varsity. He was on the youth council for the region, for the district, conference, diocese, consistory, presbytery. I'm trying to get them all in. So anyway, he left behind that place. I could tell he was mad. I could tell he was angry. I was worried that he was borderline depressed. And Ann, his mom, found out that there was no full-time youth worker, but there was a bunch of volunteers here, and so she asked us if we would do our best to try get Scott involved in the youth ministry program there at Crescent Hill Church. We did. We actually kidnapped him once with her permission and brought him to a lock-in, and he seemed to enjoy himself, but he didn't stay. He didn't stick. He was mad at God, mad at his mom, mad at his dad, mad at everybody. I was worried about him, worried about Ann, but especially for Scott. Our church board meetings are called sessions, and I was at session in the January after they'd come in the fall, and we have a prayer time, and I asked these leaders, church leaders, if they would pray, especially for Scott. And one of the elders, Janet, this tall, growing shorter, at that time she was 66 years old. At 66 years old, Janet was a power bowler and a power knitter. She could do, during one of our church board meetings, half a sweater. At the end, she would hold it up in front of our co-pastors and say, "See, at least something has been done for the kingdom of God during the course of the session meeting." Anyway, Janet asked if I would point out Scott, because she said, "I don't know who you're talking about," which is kind of odd, because our congregation is not a big congregation, 125, 130 members, so usually about 75, 80 or so in worship. And I remembered that what Scott does is he stays in his car, his mom's car, until the last possible moment. Then he sneaks in just before the call to worship, and as soon as the benediction is pronounced, what does he do? He gets out. So that's why she wouldn't know who he is. And so I said, "Well, I'll point him out to you." And so the following Sunday, I was in worship, and I went up to, and he snuck in at the back in the corner, went up to Janet, and I tapped on her shoulder and said, "He's back there." And she goes, "Oh." And I didn't see this, I missed it. But the benediction was pronounced by one of our pastors, and Scott did his routine, got up and tried to get out as soon as he possibly could. And Janet's power bowler moves kicked in. And she got him before he could leave the sanctuary. And she backed him up against the wall, and she looked straight at his belt buckle, and she said, "Scotty," which is ultimately uncool. "Scotty, remember me? I'm Janet. I'm an elder here. I'm praying for you every single day. I think you're handsome. I'm sure glad you're here. I sure do love you." And she hugged his waist. And he said, "Thanks, lady," and left. Okay? The next Sunday, he tried a different escape route out of the sanctuary, and Janet got him again. And she backed him up against the wall, and she said, Scotty, remember me? I'm Janet. I'm an elder here. I'm praying for you every single day. I sure think you're handsome. Nice belt buckle, by the way. I sure do love you. I'm glad you're here. Gave him a hug. He said, thanks, lady, and left. This went on every single Sunday. Some Sundays I learned, because I was traveling and not always there, that Janet would miss him because she would be distracted by visitors or committee work or whatever. And she learned what the car was. And so she would go out into the parking lot behind Crescent Hill Church, and she'd walk up and down until she found the car. And there's this tall, handsome junior in high school, hunkered down on the passenger side, sort of hiding. And she'd go up to the window, Scotty, get out of the car, hurry up, I have to hug you. And he'd slowly open the door and unfold his 6'6" frame and stand there. And she would reach around and best as she could, and she'd hug him and say, remember, I'm an elder here, I'm Janet, I am praying for you every day, I sure think you're handsome, I sure do love you. He'd say, thanks, lady, and get in the car, and she'd walk away. It was a year later. Scott was driving home. And Ann, his mom, told me this. Scott was driving home, and for the first time since anybody could recall, Janet wasn't at church. She had developed blood clots in her left leg, at least 3 of them, which I think you know is scary and painful. Blood clots can travel to your heart, to your brain, cause heart attacks, strokes, etc. And Scott's driving on the way home, turns to his mom and says, hey, Mom, where was that weird old lady today? And Ann said, well, honey, which weird old lady? There are many weird old ladies in our congregation. And Scott said, well, the one who always talks to me. The one who always talks to me. And Ann said, well, honey, did you hear? Her name is Janet, by the way, and we prayed for her during the pastoral prayer. It sounds like she's in a hospital because she has blood. We prayed for her. And Scott said, well, Mom, could we go there on the way home? And Ann told me that she just missed it because she said, no, sweetheart, because we're driving east, and that's downtown behind us. And Scott tried again. Thank goodness for the patience of adolescence with those of us who are adults. Scott said, Mom, could that be on the way home? And Ann said, no, sweetheart, because we're going east, and Jewish Hospital is downtown Louisville. And Scott said, Mom, do you mind if we turn the car around and go see this old lady? And Ann said, no, that'd be fine. And so they went. Okay? And Ann told me she had to run to keep up with her 6'6" senior, now basketball playing son as he's striding through the corridors of Jewish Hospital downtown Louisville, Kentucky. He barges into Janet's room on that Sunday afternoon, and she is reading her Bible. And she looks up and she says, Scotty, what are you doing? Did you come to see me? Scott says, we were just driving around. And Janet says, well, honey, I just prayed for you. I was afraid I was going to miss you. Come over, stand by the bed. I want to give you some sugar. Come by the bed. And so this handsome young man stands by this gorgeous lady's bed, and she reaches out and she hugs him and says, I was just praying for you. I'm so glad to see you. I was so afraid I was going to miss you. Then this handsome young man shoves this gorgeous lady over on her bed. He sits down. He takes his basketball wingspan arms and he wraps them around her head. And he rests his chin on top of her head. Beautiful gray hair. And he whispers, how you doing, Miss Janet? And she begins to cry. And she said, oh, sweetheart, I'm a little afraid. I haven't been in a hospital since I birthed my babies years ago. Doctors don't know what's going on. I'm a little afraid. And Scott said, oh, ma'am, you're going to be okay. And Janet said, honey, that's sweet, but I'm not so sure. And Scott said, no, ma'am, you're going to be okay. And Janet said, honey, that's sweet. And Scott said, no, ma'am, you're going to be okay. I know it. And Janet said, sweetheart, how do you know that? And Scott said, you're going to be okay because I've been praying for you every single day for almost a year. And Janet's breath caught. And she said, honey, You've been praying for me? I've been praying for you. Why are you praying for me? And Scott said, I've been praying to God and saying, okay, God, the rest of my life is in ruins, but all you have to do is take care of this one weird old lady, and I know I'm going to be okay. And Janet said, honey, why are you praying for me? I've been praying for you. And Scott said, don't you see, ma'am, because you are saving my life. You are saving my life. And Anne, his mom, who had made it to the room by then, told me she burst out into tears when she heard her son say that, because she knew at that moment that her son was going to live. Hope is not a passive thing. Hope is active. We do hope.